So decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Hans Grundberg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, it has now been over 100 days since Ansar Allah commenced a wave of detentions targeting Yemenis engaged in critical efforts related to humanitarian assistance, development, human rights, peace building, and education. I reiterate the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights on unequivocal demand for Ansar Allah to immediately and unconditionally release all those detained. This includes United Nations personnel, members of civil society, staff of diplomatic missions, private sector employees, and individuals from minority religious communities. The continued detention of these individuals is a profound injustice to those who have dedicated their lives to the betterment of Yemen. These detentions are shrinking civic space and negatively impacting humanitarian efforts critical to Yemenis. I call on Ansar Allah to do the right thing, to release those detained immediately and unconditionally, and refrain from any further arbitrary detentions. Mr. President, in these difficult circumstances, my primary objective remains the mediation of a sustainable and just resolution to the conflict in Yemen. Unfortunately, the ongoing war in Gaza and the regional escalation associated with it complicates my efforts. I echo Under Secretary General Di Carlo in her recent call to this Council for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, and a massive scale-up of humanitarian aid to Gaza as the war continues to inflict unspeakable suffering on hundreds of thousands and has extended its destabilizing effects across the broader region. These destabilizing effects, Mr. President, have also affected Yemen negatively. Ansar Allah has continued attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, threatening regional stability and international maritime security. In response, the United States and the United Kingdom have continued to strike military targets inside of Yemen. I reiterate my concern over this escalatory trajectory and repeat my call for the parties to put Yemen first and to prioritize a settlement of the conflict in Yemen. A development of particular concern is Ansar Allah's recent targeting of the Greek-flagged oil tanker MV Sunyon, which forced the abandonment of the ship and raises the imminent threat of a catastrophic oil spill and environmental disaster of unprecedented scale. An oil spill of this scale would have dire consequences for both Yemen and the broader region. I therefore express my gratitude to those member states, in particular from the region, who are currently working against the clock to bring about the urgently needed salvage operation, and will take this opportunity to strongly urge Ansar Allah to end their dangerous targeting of civilian vessels in the Red Sea and beyond. Mr. President, allow me to turn now to the situation inside of Yemen. Unfortunately, the military situation is unimproved from my last briefing. We continue to witness worrisome military activities along the front lines and escalatory rhetoric between the warring sides. While levels of violence still remain below the pre-2022 truce period, clashes in Al-Dale, in Hodeidah, Lahej, Marib, Sada, and Shabwa and Taiz are often resulting in unnecessary and tragic loss of life. The current dynamic is a stark reminder that the threat of a return to full-scale war remains ever present. On the economic front, the understanding reached between the parties on the 23rd of July on economic de-escalation has staved off an acute crisis. Yet, the status quo is untenable, and the economic situation of most Yemenis continue to decline. Adding to these challenges, the Yemeni people have been suffering from natural disasters that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable, regardless of their alignment in the conflict. The recent severe flooding in Hodeidah and Hadja governorates is a tragic example of this, and I extend my deepest condolences to the families who have lost loved ones in this disaster. The magnitude of this loss underscores the importance of remaining focused on the needs of the Yemeni people. It is also crucial that Yemenis work collaboratively across conflict lines to respond to such emergencies with urgency and without allowing political considerations to impede life-saving efforts. Despite, and indeed because of the complex challenges before us, my office remains resolute in its commitment to engage with all parties involved in the conflict to find immediate and longer-term solutions. In recent weeks, my colleagues and I have engaged in extensive discussions with key interlocutors in Aden, Taiz, Al-Dala, Muscat, Riyadh, Cairo, and London. These engagements have been constructive across various areas, including economic matters, where we seek to use the 23rd of July understanding as a stepping stone to depoliticize the economy and shift the parties away from a zero-sum mindset to one of collaboration. We have also had constructive discussions on the release of conflict-related detainees, a vital issue that remains a top priority. While I commend the parties for their constructive engagement in recent discussions, I must stress that positive signals alone are insufficient. We expect that priority be given to the Yemeni people and that positive signals be followed by concrete actions that contribute to the escalation and the advancement of peace. Moving forward, I will continue engagements with unwavering determination. Specifically, my office will work to assist the parties in implementing the July understanding on the escalation in the banking sector and Yemeni Airways through continued engagement with relevant representatives and with the objective of convening the parties without precondition to address important economic issues. We will also continue a regular communication with military commanders to ensure that any future ceasefire mechanism can function effectively. In parallel, my office is also preparing for further consultations with political parties and civil society to promote a vision for an inclusive peace process in Yemen. To date, these consultations have gathered several hundred Yemenis, including women, youth, tribal leaders, human rights defenders, and vulnerable groups. I remain deeply committed to such consultations to ensure that the voices of all segments of Yemeni society are heard, and in this regard, I look forward to the briefing of Ms. Linda Obahi from the Peace Track Initiative. Mr. President, International Peace Day, which we will honor on the 21st of September, highlights our shared responsibility to prioritize peace and promote stability in Yemen. This is not just a symbolic occasion. It is a call for action. The Yemeni people deserve the peace that they have long been waiting for. I remain steadfast in my belief that despite the numerous challenges we face, it is only through sustained and focused engagement on fundamental issues such as the economy, a nationwide ceasefire, and a comprehensive and inclusive political process that Yemen can achieve lasting peace. These elements were central to the commitments toward a roadmap made by the parties in December last year. And they continue to be as vital now as they were then. As always, I continue to count on the Council's steadfast support for my efforts, especially in seeking the release of detained UN personnel and also in refuting baseless accusations against the United Nations, such as those made recently against UNICEF, UNESCO, and other humanitarian partners. These allegations have been firmly refuted by the United Nations. And let me be absolutely clear. The United Nations, through all its agencies, will continue to work relentlessly for the well-being of the Yemeni people. I count on this Council's support and unified approach in this regard. It is more important now than ever. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Grunberg for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Special Envoy Grunberg for his update and for his tireless efforts for peace in Yemen. Mr. President, I want to start by expressing once again our deep concern about the continued arbitrary detention of United Nations personnel, non-governmental organization staff, and civil society representatives, among others, by the Houthi de facto authorities. These colleagues have now been detained for more than 3 months. 4 additional colleagues remain in detention since 2021 and 2023. I reiterate in the strongest terms the Secretary General's demand for their immediate and unconditional release. And I stress that while they remain deprived of their liberty, they must be treated with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights. This includes allowing them contact with their families and legal representatives. We continue diplomatic efforts with the Houthi de facto authorities and other interlocutors to this end. We urge all member states to exert any and all influence they have in support of these efforts. Additionally, we strongly reject false allegations by the Houthi de facto authorities against humanitarians, including recent claims of interference in Yemen's education system. These allegations threaten the safety of staff, further hinder the ability of the UN and its partners to serve the Yemeni people, and must cease immediately. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is steadily deteriorating. 62% of surveyed households report they do not have enough food to eat. This is historically high. For the first time on record, 3 districts, 2 in Hodeidah and 1 in Taiz, are facing extremely critical levels of malnutrition, IPC Phase 5. 1 more district is projected to reach this level by October. By the end of 2024, more than 600,000 children in government of Yemen-controlled areas are estimated to be acutely malnourished, and around 118,000 are projected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition, a 34% increase since 2023. Time is of the essence if we are to prevent catastrophe. The UN, together with international and national non-governmental organizations, are committed to an integrated approach that addresses the main drivers of this crisis, including disease outbreaks and poor water, sanitation, and hygiene services. Scaling up our response will require support from the international community and cooperation of the parties. Meanwhile, while needs are surging, attacks against vessels in the Red Sea continue to pose substantial environmental risks. In this regard, we are monitoring the salvage attempt of merchant vessel Sonyun closely. Mr. President, Yemen is also dealing with the effects of devastating rains, flooding, and landslides, as well as an expanding cholera epidemic. Over 500,000 people have been affected by recent weather events. More than 270,000 have been displaced. The floods have contributed to the spread of cholera and acute watery diarrhea. There have been more than 180,000 suspected cases across the country since the outbreak began. The humanitarian community, notably our local partners on the front lines of the response, is working hard to provide support to those who have been impacted by these weather events. To date, 177,000 people have received some form of emergency assistance, including cash, food, and shelter kits. However, this critical support is underfunded, limiting the supplies that are available, a challenge seen across the humanitarian response in Yemen. As we approach the final quarter of the year, the coordinated humanitarian appeal is only 29% funded. Food security and agriculture programming is only 12% funded. Shelter support activities are only 16% funded. And the rapid response mechanism, our main tool for responding to sudden onset emergencies, has received just $6.4 million of the $17.9 million needed. In response to the seriousness of this funding shortage, I have recently agreed to release $20 million from the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund for the response in Yemen. I should stress, however, that this allocation is insufficient to sustain the breadth of critical programs that the people of Yemen rely on. This allocation does not obviate the need for member states and other donors to increase their financial support for the humanitarian response. Mr. President, in addition to adequate funding, an effective response in Yemen requires that parties comply with their obligations to facilitate humanitarian relief operations. It is worrying, therefore, that access impediments and interference with humanitarian activities remain as prevalent as they are. I have already mentioned the abhorrent detention of humanitarian workers. In addition, during the first 7 months of 2024, our humanitarian partners reported 572 access incidents across Yemen. Of these, direct interference in humanitarian activities by the parties accounted for 217 incidents, a noticeable increase from the 169 such incidents reported in 2023. We have recently received assurances from the new cabinet formed by the Houthi de facto authorities that they will work with the UN and the humanitarian community at large to address these challenges. We urge them to take concrete steps to fulfill these commitments, protect humanitarian workers, release all those arbitrarily detained, and facilitate humanitarian assistance. In the meantime, Mr. President, we have taken steps to minimize the exposure of staff to risk in Houthi-controlled areas. To this end, the United Nations has recently undertaken a program prioritization exercise. The result will be a narrower response focused on essential life-saving and life-sustaining activities. Broader activities, such as capacity building and institutional support, will be deprioritized. United Nations agencies are now engaging with their donors on their respective programs and next steps. When the minimum requirements are met for the safety and security of United Nations personnel and other humanitarian workers, it is our sincere hope that we can once again expand programming. Mr. President, as I have previously stated in this Council, the humanitarian community is committed to staying and delivering in Yemen as best it can for as long as it takes. To do this, we need the parties to respect international humanitarian law by immediately releasing our detained colleagues, protecting civilians and humanitarian workers, and facilitating unimpeded humanitarian access. But as we have also repeatedly stated, humanitarian assistance cannot provide a long-term solution. I urge the parties to turn aside from the path of conflict and prioritize progress on a sustainable peace. I once again urge the Council and all member states to support them on this path. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Linda Al-Obahi.
سيدي الرئيس، أصحاب السعادة.
Mr. President,
اسمحوا لي
Excellencies,
في البداية أن أعرب عن شكري على إتاحة الفرصة للتقديم
I would
الإحاطي
like at the
اليوم.
outset to thank you for the
اسمي ليندا
opportunity to
العباهي،
brief you today.
مستشارة أولى
My
مختصة في
name
الشؤون
is Linda
السياسية
Al-Obahi. I
والوساطة،
am a senior political
وأمثل
affairs
مؤسسة
and
مبادرة
mediation
مسار
advisor
السلام وشبكة
representing
التضامن
the Peace
النسوي.
Track Initiative and
يركز
the
عملنا
Women
على دعم
Solidarity
بناء
Network.
سلام شامل
Our
في
work
اليمن
focuses on
ومناصرة
supporting
حقوق
inclusive peace
النساء.
building in Yemen and advocating for
ستركز
women's
كلمتي
rights.
اليوم على
My
تدهور حقوق
statement
النساء
today
في
will
اليمن،
focus on the
حيث
deterioration of
تشكل
women's
النساء
rights in Yemen.
والفتيات
Women and girls
49%
are
من أصل
49% of the
18.2 شخص
18.2
يحتاجون
million
إلى
people
مساعدة
in need of
إنسانية،
humanitarian assistance
ويواجهون انعدام الأمن
and face
الغذائي
food
وشح
insecurity,
المياه
water
والأمراض
shortages,
وعدم
disease,
القدرة على
lack
الوصول
of
إلى
access
الخدمات
to
الأساسية
basic life-saving
المنقذة
services
للحياة كالرعاية
such
الصحية
as healthcare
والتعليم،
and
فضلاً
education,
عن الفقر والحرمان من
poverty,
الفرص
and deprivation
الاقتصادية
of economic
والإقصاء
opportunities,
والقمع
and
الممنهج
systematic
لحقوقهن.
exclusion and suppression of their
فهناك
rights.
6.3 مليون
6.3
امرأة وفتاة
million
يمنية
Yemeni women
معرضات
and
بشكل
girls
متزايد
are at
لمخاطر العنف
heightened
القائم
risk
على
of
النوع
gender-based
الاجتماعي،
violence,
بما في ذلك العنف
including
الأسري
domestic
والعنف
and
الجنسي،
sexual violence.
وقد اضطرت العديد منهن
Many have been
للتأقلم
forced
واتباع
to
آليات
resort to
تكيف
extreme coping
قاسية
mechanisms,
كالزواج القسري
including forced
والزواج
and early
المبكر،
marriage,
حيث أن أكثر من 30%
with over
من الفتيات
30% of
يتزوجن
girls
قبل سن
married by the age
18
of
عاماً.
18.
كما تتعرض النساء والفتيات
Women
من
and
الفئات
girls from
المهمشة
minorities
والأقليات،
and marginalized
بما في
groups,
ذلك النساء
including the
المهمشات
Muhammadin
والبهائيات،
and
للأضرار
Baha'is,
الجسيمة
are
أكثر من
further
غيرهن،
disproportionately
حيث
impacted.
تتعرض النساء والفتيات المهمشات
Muhammadin
للاعتداءات
women and
والعنف
girls are
الجنسي
increasingly
والتعذيب
subjected to targeted
والاستغلال.
attacks, including sexual violence,
وتواجه
torture,
حقوق
and
الإنسان للنساء
exploitation.
وخاصة
Women's
حريتهن
human
في
rights,
التنقل
particularly their freedom
لقيود
of
شديدة
movement, are
من قبل
heavily
كافة
restricted
الأطراف
by
المتحاربة
all
في
the
اليمن،
warring parties in
ففرض
Yemen.
مرافقة المحرم
The imposition of a
وقوانين
mahram,
الالتزام بلباس
dress
محدد
code,
وتقييد الحق في
restrictions
حرية
on freedom
التعبير،
of
ولا
expression,
سيما في المناطق التي
especially in
يسيطر عليها
Houthi-controlled
الحوثيون،
areas,
تقوض قدرة النساء
impede
على
women's
العمل
ability
حتى
to
في المجال
work,
الإنساني،
including in the
والحصول على
humanitarian
الرعاية
sector,
الصحية
their
والتعليم
access to healthcare and
والمشاركة في الحياة
education,
العامة
and to
ككل.
participate in public life.
فغالبا ما تتعرض المدافعات عن
Yemeni
حقوق
women, human
الإنسان
rights
وبانيات
defenders,
السلام
and peacebuilders
اليمنيات
are often
للتشهير
subjected
العلني
to public
والعنف
defamation,
والتهديدات عبر
online
الإنترنت.
violence, and
ففي
threats to
السنوات
their
القليلة
safety.
الماضية
In the past few
دعمت
years,
مؤسسة مبادرة مسار
PTI
السلام
has
أكثر من
supported
150
over
مدافعة عن حقوق
150
الإنسان،
women defenders
90%
of human rights
منهن
fleeing
هربن من مناطق
Houthi-controlled
سيطرة
areas
الحوثيين،
with protection
وتم
support.
تقديم منح الحماية لهن. خلال هذا الصراع ارتكبت جميع الأطراف عمليات إخفاء قسري واعتقالات تعسفية، فقد وثق خبراء الأمم المتحدة في اليمن بشكل مستمر حالات احتجاز تعسفي وتعذيب جسدي ونفسي واغتصاب، وحالات انتزاع الاعترافات بالإكراه من قبل النساء والفتيات، وخاصة في سجون الحوثيين، حيث تشمل تلك الاعتقالات فتيات لا تتجاوز أعمارهن 14 عاماً. كما وثقت المنظمات النسائية اليمنية المحلية أشكالاً وحشية من العنف الجنسي أثناء الاحتجاز، كتشويه الأعضاء والإجهاض القسري، كما يتم قطع أي تواصل بين المحتجزات وبين العالم الخارجي، وفي بعض الحالات وضع بعضهن في الحبس الانفرادي، إضافة لحرمان النساء اللواتي أكملن مدة عقوبتهن من الإفراج عنهن إلا بحضور ولي أمر ذكر، وحرمانهن من حقوقهن القانونية بما فيها التواصل مع المحامين وأفراد الأسرة. لذا يجب أن يكون إطلاق سراح النساء المعتقلات أولوية في جميع المفاوضات، حيث غالباً ما يتم التغافل عن معاناتهن التي تتفاقم بسبب العنف والإهمال والعار المجتمعي. فعلى الرغم من جهود القيادات النسائية والوسيطات المحليات لدعم النساء المعتقلات، إلا أنهن يواجهن معوقات كبيرة، منها صعوبة الوصول ونقص الإمكانيات والموارد. ومن المقلق جدا عدم وجود نساء في لجان تبادل الأسرى والمعتقلين واستبعادهن بشكل تام تقريبا من قوائم الذين يجري التفاوض على إطلاق سراحهم. أصحاب السعادة، لقد وثقت منظمات المجتمع المدني اليمني قيام الحوثيين باحتجاز ما لا يقل عن 3600 شخص منذ عام 2017، وغالبا ما يتم ذلك دون إجراءات قانونية أو أوامر اعتقال صحيحة أو تهم، مع منعهم من التواصل مع أسرهم. ومع ذلك فإن الحملة الأخيرة التي شنها الحوثيون منذ 31 مايو والتي استهدفت أفراداً عاملين لدى الأمم المتحدة ومنظمات غير حكومية دولية ووطنية
بالاعتقال التعسفي والإخفاء القسري والاتهام بالتجسس حملة غير مسبوقة. فقد وثقت الأمم المتحدة اعتقال ما لا يقل عن 60 مدني يمني تعرضوا للاعتقال التعسفي، بينهم 6 نساء تعرضن بعضهن للاعتقال مع أطفالهن وأزواجهن، لكننا نخشى أن يكون العدد أعلى من ذلك بكثير. إضافة للتعليمات الموجهة للموظفين والموظفات لدى الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات غير الحكومية الدولية المتواجدين في مناطق سيطرة الحوثيين لمواصلة العمل والتعامل مع الوضع القائم دون إجراءات سلامة كافية يعرض الموظفين لمزيد من المخاطر. علاوة على ذلك، كان الدعم المقدم لأسر هؤلاء المعتقلين غير كافي مع محدودية المعلومات والموارد المالية والدعم. وتمثل هذه الانتهاكات الصارخة لحقوق الإنسان والقانون الإنساني الدولي جزءاً من استراتيجية أوسع لقمع الفضاء المدني والسياسي المتبقي في مناطق سيطرة الحوثيين وإثارة الذعر الشديد وتحديد العمليات الإنسانية في اليمن. وأنا هنا اليوم ليس فقط لإظهار خطورة تلك الانتهاكات، بل أيضاً للتعبير عن خيبة الأمل العميقة التي يشعر بها غالبة اليمنيين واليمنيات من المواقف الدولية الواهنة إزاء تلك التطورات. أنا هنا لأناشد وكالات الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الدولية العاملة في اليمن للمطالبة بشدة بالإفراج الفوري وغير المشروط عن المعتقلين والمعتقلات وبذل جهود أكبر للدفاع عنهم والتصدي علنا لاتهامات الحوثيين الباطلة لبعضهم بالتجسس. والأهم من ذلك لحث المجتمع الدولي على التحرك بحزم لحماية الجهود والعمليات الإنسانية في اليمن والتي تعد ضرورية جدا لحياة الملايين من اليمنيين. ويجب أن يشمل ذلك وضع خطوط حمراء واضحة بشأن توزيع المساعدات والتعامل مع المجتمع المدني والالتزام الدائم باحترام حقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني ومحاسبة الحوثيين على أفعالهم. سيد الرئيس، أصحاب السعادة، اليمنيون متعبون من استمرار الصراع ويسعون بشدة إلى تحقيق الأمن والسلام والاستقرار، ولكن لا تزال الانقسامات العميقة وانعدام الثقة بين الأطراف اليمنية والتي تزداد تعقيدا بسبب التدخلات الخارجية ومحاولات التوصل إلى اتفاقات أحادية تعيق التوصل إلى حل سياسي. ولكن رغم تلك التحديات لا يزال هناك أمل في تحقيق تقدم في حل الأزمة اليمنية. إن جهود المبعوث الخاص لدفع المفاوضات نحو عملية سياسية يمنية مع معالجة التحديات الإنسانية والاقتصادية الملحة تمثل المسار الأكثر قابلية للتطبيق لتحقيق الاستقرار. وعلى الرغم من كون المشاورات مع ممثلات عن نساء اليمن خطوة إيجابية في الاتجاه الصحيح، إلا أنها قد تظل رمزية إذا لم تمنح النساء الفرصة للتأثير الفاعل على عملية السلام التي تقودها الأمم المتحدة. فللمرة الأولى منذ 24 عاماً لا توجد لدينا نساء في مناصب وزارية أو في عضوية مجلس القيادة الرئاسي، وهن ممثلات اسمياً بنسبة 10% في هيئة التشاور والمصالحة، و14% في الفريق الاقتصادي، و22% في الفريق القانوني الذي يدعم مجلس القيادة الرئاسي بصفة استشارية. كما أنهن غائبات تماماً عن اللجنة الرئاسية التي شكلت مؤخراً لمعالجة مطالب أبناء محافظة حضرموت. إضافة لما سبق، تغيب النساء تماماً عن لجان مفاوضات عمليات السلام بما فيها تلك التي ترعاها الأمم المتحدة كلجنة تبادل الأسرى والمعتقلين ولجان الأمن والجيش وتعز. على الرغم من البيانات والقرارات الصادرة عن مجلسكم الموقر والداعية إلى مشاركة النساء مشاركة فاعلة، لقد عملت القيادات النسائية والمجتمع المدني جنباً إلى جنب لمكافحة هذا الإقصاء من خلال تطوير خارطة الطريق النسوية للسلام. وعلى الرغم من تلك المحاولات وبعد عقد من الزمان من اعتماد مؤتمر الحوار الوطني الشامل حصة 30% كحد أدنى للمشاركة السياسية للنساء، لا نزال نواجه التهميش.
أصحاب السعادة،
Excellencies,
أود أن أختتم إحاطتي
I would
بدعوة
like to
مجلس
conclude
الأمن
by
إلى
calling
اتخاذ
on the Security
الخطوات
Council
التالية.
to take the following
حث
actions.
جميع الأطراف
Urge
لإرساء
all
سلام
parties to
شامل
establish a
وجامع
comprehensive, inclusive,
وعادل
just and
ومستدام
sustainable peace
محوره العدالة
that
الانتقالية
centers
وحقوق
transitional
الإنسان.
justice and human
يجب
rights.
أن تضمن المفاوضات
All
المشاركة
negotiations must ensure
المشاركة
the
الفاعلة
meaningful
للنساء والشباب
participation of women,
والأقليات
youth,
والأشخاص
minorities,
ذوي
people with
الإعاقة
disabilities,
والفئات المهمشة
marginalized groups,
وضحايا
victims
انتهاكات
and
الحقوق والناجين
survivors of
منها
rights abuses,
والمدافعين عن
human
حقوق
rights
الإنسان
defenders,
والمجتمع
and
المدني.
civil society.
كما يجب ضمان مشاركة النساء
Women
في
must be
عمليات صنع
included in
القرار
all
بما
decision-making
فيها
processes,
جهود الوساطة
including mediation
ووقف
and
إطلاق النار
ceasefire efforts,
وإشراكهن في
and
جميع
in
لجان
all
السلام التي
UN-supported
تدعمها
peace
الأمم
committees,
المتحدة بدءا بتطبيق
starting with
الحد
the
الأدنى
implementation
لحصة
of the minimum
30%
30%
لتمثيل
quota
النساء.
for women.
مطالبة جميع الأطراف
Call on
باحترام
all
القانون
parties to
الدولي
respect
الإنساني
international
والقانون
humanitarian
الدولي
and human
لحقوق
rights
الإنسان
law
وضمان
and
المساءلة
ensure
عن كافة
accountability
الجرائم
for all
المرتكبة.
crimes committed.
كما أدعوكم
I urge you
لرفض أي
to
شكل من
reject
أشكال الحصانات
general immunities
العامة أو
or
العدالة
selective
الانتقائية.
justice.
التأكيد على ضرورة احترام
Demand that
جميع
all
الأطراف
parties respect the human
لحقوق
rights of women,
النساء بما في ذلك رفع القيود
including
عن
by lifting
حركتهن
restrictions on their
وإنهاء
movement,
استهداف المدافعات
ending
عن
the
حقوق
targeting of
الإنسان
women human
والوقف
rights
الفوري
defenders,
لجميع
and
أعمال
immediately
العنف
seizing
القائم
all
على
acts
النوع
of
الاجتماعي.
gender-based violence.
إدانة كافة التهديدات الموجهة
all
للعاملين
threats to
والعاملات في المجال
humanitarian
الإنساني
workers
والمطالبة
and
بالإفراج
demand
الفوري
the
وغير
immediate and
المشروط
unconditional
عن كل
release of all
المعتقلين
those who have
تعسفيا
been arbitrarily
بما فيهم
detained,
النساء
including
وجميع
women,
موظفي
as
الأمم
well as
المتحدة
all UN
والمنظمات
and
غير
NGO
الحكومية
staff.
واحترام حقوقهم
Their human
الإنسانية
rights must
وضرورة
be
تمكينهم من
respected
الوصول
and
إلى
they must have
أسرهم
access to their
وإلى
families and
ممثليهم
legal
القانونيين
representatives
والحصول على
and
دعم
receive
شامل.
comprehensive support.
الرئيس أصحاب السعادة.
President,
يعيش
Excellencies,
اليمن اليوم
Yemen is
حالة
in a
من
state of
الجمود
limbo.
فلا حرب
Neither at war
ولا سلام
nor at peace.
ومعاناتنا
Our
المتواصلة لعقد من
decade-long
الزمن
suffering
ستستمر
will
للأجيال
echo through
القادمة إذا
generations
لم
if
يتوقف
the
الصراع.
conflict persists.
حان وقت
It is
السلام.
time for peace. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Al-Obahi for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful to Special Envoy Grimberg and Acting USG Messiah for their briefing. And I also thank Ms. Al-Obahi for her vital insights that serve as a timely reminder of the importance of engagement with civil society and the Yemeni community, especially women, in order to achieve long-term stability and peace in Yemen. I also welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of Yemen in our meeting today. Let me make 3 points. First, I join the briefers in highlighting the plight of UN, NGO workers and staff and former staff of diplomatic missions who remain in Houthi captivity. It is over 3 months since their detention. That's 3 months of families being torn apart by the unprovoked and arbitrary act. And 3 months of reducing the humanitarian community's capacity to be able to fully support Yemenis in need. There is no justification for this. We once again call on the Houthis to immediately and unconditionally release those detained. Second, I join Ms. Messiah in highlighting the severe constraints on humanitarian access in Yemen, especially in Houthi-controlled areas. The reckless actions of the Houthis are further restricting an already complex and hostile operating environment, making it almost impossible to get aid to those who need it. We must all be clear about the importance of safe and effective humanitarian access so that we can continue to deliver critical, life-saving support to the Yemeni people. Third, we once again reiterate this Council's call for the Houthis to cease their dangerous and illegal attacks on maritime shipping. The recent attack on the MV Sunion is a clear example of the Houthis' disregard for the catastrophic environmental and economic consequences of their actions for both Yemen and for the region. We call for the immediate cessation of arms supplies to Houthis. The continued supply of advanced weapons which enables these attacks shows complete disregard for the UN arms embargo. President, to conclude, the UK is grateful to Special Envoy Grimberg's efforts to facilitate economic dialogue, de-escalate tensions, and preserve space for a future peace process. We are unwavering in our support to his efforts to secure an inclusive, sustainable peace in Yemen. And we continue to call on all parties to de-escalate tensions and preserve space for negotiations under UN auspices. Rather than pursuing reckless attacks and the detention of innocent civilians, we urge the Houthis to prioritise the needs of Yemenis by engaging with peace process negotiations. I thank you.
I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je
Thank you, Mr.
remercie l'envoyé
President.
spécial
I'd
Hans
like to thank
Grunberg,
Special Envoy Hans
général
Grunberg,
adjoint à
acting
l'intérim aux affaires
USG
humanitaires,
for
Joyce
Humanitarian
Mzia,
Affairs,
ainsi
Joyce
que Madame Linda
Msuya,
Al-Obahi de la
as
Peace
well
Track
as Linda
Initiative, pour
Al-Obahi
leurs
of the Peace
interventions
Track
pertinentes.
Initiative for their relevant
In the blink of an eye,
briefings.
the storm
In the
hit
blink
and
of an
took
eye, the
everything.
storm
Le
came
témoignage
and took
d'Ali, père
everything.
d'une famille
The
déjà
testimony of
déplacée par
Ali,
le
father
conflit
of
au
a
Yémen,
family already
illustre
displaced by the
l'impact
conflict
des
in Yemen,
intempéries
illustrates the
inédites
impact
qui ont
of the
touché le pays ces
unprecedented
dernières
severe
semaines.
weather that has hit the
Des
country
milliers de
in
personnes
recent
ont été
weeks.
déplacées, de nombreuses
Thousands of
infrastructures
people have been
essentielles
displaced,
ont
much
été
essential
détruites.
infrastructure has
Ce
been
type de
destroyed.
phénomène météorologique
Such weather events,
intensifié par le changement
exacerbated by
climatique,
climate change,
aggrave la situation
further
humanitaire.
worsen the
Ils s'ajoutent
humanitarian
ainsi aux
situation.
tensions
They
régionales
also
aiguës
contribute to
qui mettent en
acute
péril le
regional
processus
tensions
politique
that threaten
accompagné par l'ONU.
the
Je
UN-supported
souhaite mettre
political
l'accent sur
process.
3 points
I would like to
essentiels
emphasize three
nécessaires pour
essential
protéger la
points
population yéménite
necessary to
et lui
protect the
permettre
Yemeni
de faire
people
face à
and
ce
to
défi.
enable them to face these challenges.
Premièrement, les parties
First,
doivent s'abstenir de
the
toute
parties
action
must refrain
susceptible
from any
d'aggraver
action
la situation
that could worsen the
environnementale.
environmental
En mer Rouge,
situation.
les attaques
In the Red
récurrentes
Sea,
contre les pétroliers
repeated
doivent cesser.
attacks on oil tankers
La
must
prise
cease.
pour cible à plusieurs reprises du navire cité en
Repeated
Sunyan
attacks
ces
on
dernières
the
semaines est
Sunyan
particulièrement
tanker in
choquante.
recent weeks are
La
particularly
dérive de son
shocking.
épave transportant quelques
Its wreck,
150
carrying
000
some
tonnes de pétrole,
150,000
serait
tons
toujours
of
en proie
oil
aux flammes.
is reportedly
Nous
still
appelons toutes les
drifting in
parties à
flames.
permettre son
We call
sauvetage
on all
rapide et
parties to
sans
ensure its
condition
prompt and
et son
unconditional
amarrage à bon
rescue
port
and safe
afin
berthing
d'éviter une
in
catastrophe
order to
humanitaire
avert
et écologique
a major
majeure. Ce
humanitarian and
Conseil doit rester
environmental
saisi de cette
disaster.
problématique
This Council
à
must
l'image
remain
de son
seized of
engagement
this
unanime
issue,
en faveur de
as it was
l'opération de
unanimous in
sauvetage du
its support
pétrolier
for the
Safar.
rescue of the Safar tanker.
Aussi, nous exhortons toutes les parties à privilégier la
We
désescalade et à
therefore urge
choisir la
all
voie
parties to give
diplomatique.
priority to
À cet égard,
de-escalation
nous
and to
appelons
choose
à
the
la libération
diplomatic route.
immédiate
In
de
this regard, we
l'équipage
call for
et
the
la
immediate
restitution
release
du
of the
Galaxy
crew
Leader,
and the return
tel
of the
qu'exige
Galaxy
la
Leader,
résolution
as demanded
2722.
in Resolution 2722.
Deuxièmement, le bon déroulement des
Second,
opérations
the smooth
humanitaires sur le
running of
terrain est
humanitarian
d'importance
operations on the
cruciale.
ground is crucial.
Il est impératif que la population
It is
puisse
imperative that
accéder
the
à
population
l'assistance
have
humanitaire dont elle a
unconditional
besoin,
access to the
et ce,
humanitarian
sans condition,
assistance they
et dans la
need
totalité du
without
pays.
preconditions throughout the
L'aide
country.
humanitaire ne doit pas être
Humanitarian aid
instrumentalisée.
must
Le
not
personnel
be
humanitaire
exploited.
doit être
Humanitarian
protégé, comme le
personnel
demande
must
le
be
droit
protected
international
as
humanitaire
required by
et
international
comme le rappelle la
humanitarian law
résolution
and as
2730.
stated in
À ce
Resolution
titre, nous
2730.
réitérons l'appel
In
de
this
l'ONU
respect,
exprimé une fois
we
de plus
reiterate the
aujourd'hui
UN's call
à
expressed once
procéder
again
à la
today
libération
for the
immédiate et sans
immediate and
condition de tout
unconditional
le personnel
release
onusien
of all
et
detained
humanitaire
UN
détenus.
and humanitarian
Les
personnel.
efforts des Nations Unies
The
et des
efforts
autres
of the
acteurs
UN and
humanitaires en
other
faveur de la
humanitarian
population
actors on
et pour
behalf
la
of the
promotion des
population
droits de l'homme
and for the
ne doivent
promotion
pas
of
être
human rights
entravés
must not
et
be hindered,
facilités.
but rather
Nous accueillons
facilitated.
favorablement la
We
restitution du
welcome
bureau du Haut
the return
Commissariat
of
aux
the
droits de
Office of
l'homme
the High
à l'ONU.
Commissioner for Human Rights to
Nous
the
espérons
UN.
qu'il s'agit d'un
We
premier pas
hope that this is
positif
the
parmi
first
d'autres
of
à
other
venir.
positive steps to come.
Finalement, seule une solution
Finally,
politique au
only
conflit
a political
permettra de
solution to the
répondre aux
conflict
besoins
will
de la
make it
population
possible to meet the
yéménite.
needs of the
La
Yemeni
Suisse
people.
appelle à la préservation des
Switzerland
acquis
calls for the
dans les
gains made in
discussions
the
de
peace
paix au
talks in
Yémen
Yemen to be
et à la
preserved,
poursuite des
and for
pourparlers de
peace
paix
talks
sous
to
l'égide des
continue
Nations
under
Unies.
the aegis of the United
Nous réitérons
Nations.
notre plein
We
soutien à
reiterate our
l'envoyé
full
spécial Hans
support for
Grunberg
Special
et à
Envoy
son
Hans
équipe.
Grunberg
Nous
and his
saluons leurs
team.
efforts pour
We
une mise
welcome
en
their
œuvre
efforts
complète
to ensure
de
full
l'accord sur les
implementation
mesures
of the
bancaires
agreement
et sur le
on
secteur
banking
des
measures
transports.
and on the transport sector.
Monsieur le Président, la tempête à
President,
laquelle doit faire
the
face la
storm
population yéménite
facing
a
the
de
people of
multiples
Yemen
facettes
is
qui
multifaceted
sont intimement liées.
and
La
interrelated.
situation actuelle doit nous
The current
inviter à redoubler
situation
des
should
efforts et
prompt
à
us to
rester saisis
redouble our
de la
efforts
situation.
and to remain
À cet
seized
égard,
of the
la
situation.
population
In
yéménite
this
peut
respect,
compter
the
sur le
Yemeni
plein
people
soutien
can count
de la Suisse.
on Switzerland's
Je vous
full
remercie.
support. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement document on behalf of the A3 Plus members, namely Algeria, Guyana, Mozambique, and my own country, Sierra Leone. We thank Special Envoy Hans Gumberg, Acting Under Secretary General, Joyce Musuya, and Ms. Linda Al-Obahi for their comprehensive briefings and insight on the situation, on the security and humanitarian situations in Yemen. We also welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen in this meeting. Mr. President, at the outset, the A3+ reiterates its call for the immediate release of all UN staff and other aid workers who have been arbitrarily detained in Yemen. The illegal detention of UN staff and humanitarian aid workers in Yemen is a violation of international humanitarian law. We strongly condemn these attacks and call for the perpetrators to be held accountable for these unacceptable acts. The A3+ is deeply concerned about the escalating security situation and the dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which has not showed signs of abating. This month of September marks the 10th year since the war in Yemen broke out, a decade of instability and immense hardship that has profoundly impacted millions of lives. Over these 10 years, Yemen has faced immense challenges, from political and security instability to severe economic decline and devastating humanitarian crisis. Yemen has been a battleground for competing factions with devastating consequences for its people. The continued instability has drastically shrunk economic activity, severely impeded the flow of essential goods and services. The flow of urgently needed humanitarian aid has been further impeded by bureaucratic barriers, exacerbating the already dire conditions for millions of Yemenis. As we reflect on this brutal reality for the country, it is important to acknowledge the resilience and enduring spirit of the people who, despite immense adversity, continue to hope for a better future. We must renew our commitment to finding a lasting resolution to the conflict. As we've heard from our briefers, the condition of Yemeni civilians remain grim, a situation that is made even more precarious given the intensification of attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea and the border region. As we meet today, the challenges to advancing the UN roadmap and effort to end the suffering of Yemeni people appear intractable. Nevertheless, we must persevere. With this in mind, we would like to emphasize the following 4 points. First, we are alarmed by the acts of the Houthis, who continue to jeopardize the active maritime ecosystem in the Red Sea and impede political solutions for lasting peace. The escalating attacks on oil tankers, some of which are set ablaze and have been sunk, pose significant economic, security, and environmental threat to Yemen and the wider region. One such vessel is the MV Delta Sunion. Noting efforts to salvage it and prevent an ecological disaster posed by its cargo of 1 million barrels of crude oil. These attacks are a clear signal that the Houthis are tightening their grip on commercial traffic in the Red Sea. The optic of these attacks have posed sustained threat to commercial activities in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. This has significantly dropped the volume of traffic through the Suez Canal and the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, vital arteries for international trade. If left unchecked, these actions could potentially destabilize the border region and disrupt one of the world's most significant waterways. These egregious actions have already adversely affected political discussions to bring the country to a peaceful path. We therefore call on the Houthis to cease their destructive actions and to respect and implement all resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2216, that demands inter alia that the Houthis, and I quote, refrain from any provocation or threat to neighboring states, end of quote. The A3+ strongly believes that a prompt response and diligent action are needed to address the wider conflict in the region, with the urgency of a ceasefire in Gaza, which cannot be overstated, as it remains key to the stability of the Middle East. Second, we continue to express grave concern about the arbitrary detention of UN staff members and aid workers by Houthis. For over 3 months, UN staff and other humanitarian aid workers have been targeted and held captive by Houthis de facto authorities. No access has been given to verify the well-being of the individuals being held, and they remain without legal protections. The sacrifices made by the UN and humanitarian personnel delivering critical aid in a country ravaged by war has been a lifeline to millions of Yemenis. The A3+ condemns these deliberate violations of international law. We reiterate our call for the unconditional and immediate release of all UN staff and humanitarian personnel detained by the Houthis. We urge the Houthis to ensure the safety and security of all humanitarian and UN personnel. Third, we reiterate our call for increasing financial and logistical support towards aid efforts in Yemen as they deal with one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Reports from UN agencies indicate that more than half of the country's population, over 18.2 million people, require some form of humanitarian assistance, including 17 million facing severe food shortages. Limited access to clean water and sanitation has also resulted in a growing cholera outbreak. The impact of adverse weather events, including violent windstorms and floods from torrential rain, has been severe, claiming lives and halting distribution of life-saving aid and essential supplies. The scale of the disaster demands our urgent attention and a swift, coordinated response to alleviate the suffering of those affected. We urge UN agencies, donor countries, and international organizations to fully fund and mobilize resources for the 2024 Yemen Humanitarian Response Plan, which is targeted inter alia towards urgent emergency aid, provision of essential services, as well as cash injection interventions. The current level of aid falls short of addressing the magnitude of the crisis. It is imperative that we mobilize the necessary resources to provide comprehensive relief and support to those affected populations. Our collective response must match the scale of the disaster to mitigate its impact and help Yemen recover and rebuild. We emphasize the importance of targeted support towards emergency agricultural assistance in collaboration with relevant agencies to support vulnerable rural communities engaged in farming, fishing, and livestock rearing with cash assistance, rehabilitation of productive infrastructure, and other means of restoring and protecting livelihoods. Fourth, we express grave concern about the lack of progress in reaching agreement on a political roadmap. We are of the firm belief that dialogue and diplomatic efforts by the United Nations and regional actors are the surest path to lasting peace in Yemen. Influential regional actors should continue to engage all Yemeni parties towards the revitalization of a Yemeni-led and owned political dialogue. The Yemeni people need to see an end to the current military operations in Yemen, including maritime military operations. In this regard, we commend the exceptional efforts of the Special Envoy for his commitment to addressing instability in Yemen and express our full support to him and his team in this regard. In conclusion, the A3+ is aware of the complexity of the crisis in Yemen and certainly mindful that there are no quick fixes. However, the current stalemate on political talks provides little hope for the people of Yemen. We therefore urge all parties to engage in good faith to relaunch an inclusive political engagement process, including recent diplomatic engagement in Aden, Muscat, Riyadh, to bring an end to the suffering of the Yemeni people. The A3+ remains committed to supporting a Yemeni-owned and led political process that will lead to lasting peace for the good of the Yemeni people who have suffered for way too long. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Yemen, Mr. Hans Grunberg, as well as the Acting Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Madam Joyce Msuya, for their briefings. We listened attentively to Linda Al-Albani as well. The situation in that country, as has been attested to by today's briefers, is steadily deteriorating. It has not yet been possible to rekindle Yemeni settlement. Internecine fighting has compounded region-wide turbulence, which is directly affecting developments in Yemen. However, the fact that a large-scale escalation has so far been averted shows that the Yemeni protagonists continue to maintain an interest in the pursuit of dialogue. There's an important need to maintain this and to support this approach of the parties to the conflict to prompt them to seek mutually acceptable solutions without abrupt steps, including at the socioeconomic level. These are liable to, over the long term, generate grave political risks, not to mention making the lives of ordinary Yemenis all the more difficult. We trust that Mr. Grunberg will pursue proactive efforts to rekindle the negotiations process, including through launch of the roadmap with the participation of all Yemeni protagonists, including the Ansar Allah movement, as well as leading regional players. We wish to recall the need to, with time, renew the normative legal basis for Yemeni settlement. Mr. President, we, like other of our Security Council colleagues, are concerned by the situation with those 13 local UN staff members who were detained in June 2024. Regardless of how serious the allegations against them are, these people need to receive the necessary medical assistance and humanitarian aid and must be able to communicate with their families. We believe it is unacceptable that we view as unacceptable any actions that violate the privileges and immunities of United Nations structure and personnel. These kinds of actions are unacceptable not just in Yemen, by the way, but also in other parts of the world. There can be no double standards here. In this connection, it is difficult to understand why some members of the United Nations Security Council, on the one hand, so emphatically are demanding that the Houthis release the detainees, and on the other hand, they are shamefully overlooking the developments in Gaza and the West Bank of the Jordan River. Why have they not voiced similar demands to Israel, which has detained UNRWA personnel without any compelling justifications? Why are they not demanding their release? And if West Jerusalem refers to the need to conduct a thorough additional investigation vis-à-vis the detained, then we all need to insist on investigations being conducted into similar instances of the deaths of humanitarian workers in both Gaza and the West Bank. Let us recall that during the current escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there have been reported the deaths of at least 286 humanitarian workers, of whom 209 people are UN staff. And we're mostly talking about UNRWA staff here. That is 205 individuals. Yesterday, as a result of another Israeli airstrike targeting a school, another 6 UNRWA staff died. And these are just humanitarian personnel. Also, journalists are increasingly falling victim to these operations. More than 160 people have died. Medical personnel are falling victim. 500 medical personnel have already died. However, to date, we have not received any information about holding perpetrators of these crimes to account if such investigations are even being conducted at all. We urge the members of the Council to demonstrate unity and consistency on this issue too. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Yemen is shattering all prior grim records. The number of starving people, including children, is growing. More than 500,000 people have been afflicted by destructive storms and floods, especially in the western coast of the country. The cholera epidemic continues to rage. Hundreds of thousands of people have been infected. Hundreds of people have already died. And at the same time, the financing shortfall is significantly impeding the ability of humanitarian workers to curb the spread of this disease. The year is drawing to a close, and yet the UN humanitarian plan on Yemen is only 29% funded. This situation
critically requires the merger and the pooling of the efforts of the international community as a whole. At the same time, we must also bear in mind the need to resolve core issues of maintaining peace and security both within the country as well as in the region. Of paramount importance, among other things, is bringing to an end the military operations in the Red Sea. This, however, is being impeded by the focus of the U.S. and the U.K. to continue to mount a military resistance to Ansar Allah, instead of seeking effective ways to quell the current unprecedented escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which the Houthis have identified as the reason for the steps that they have undertaken. They, the U.S. and U.K., are undertaking aggressive acts against the sovereign country of Yemen, further escalating the situation. Let me be clear, we are not justifying the actions of Ansar Allah in the Red Sea. The Russian Federation condemns attacks on commercial vessels. We call for restraint from any measures which impede freedom of international navigation, and we call for the release of the Galaxy leader and its crew, who have for nearly 10 months have been detained. We are also very much concerned that the Sunyon oil tanker, which is drifting off the coast of Yemen, the blaze on board has still not been extinguished there. However, nothing in the above mentioned can justify the gross violation of the sovereignty of Yemen or strikes against its soil. And this is specifically what the Western coalition is doing. There is a real risk that if the situation remains unchanged, the results of protracted and painstaking efforts to seek mutually acceptable solutions for the Yemenis on parameters to relaunch the Yemeni political process will be jeopardized. We believe that the Security Council of the United Nations has an obligation to do everything possible to avoid such a scenario. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier Hans
Grunberg,
Joyce Msuya et Linda Al-Obaï de leurs exposés sur la situation au Yémen. Je voudrais également saluer la présence parmi nous du représentant permanent du Yémen. Monsieur le Président, les Houthis doivent cesser immédiatement leurs activités déstabilisatrices en mer Rouge. Ces attaques portent atteinte à la liberté de navigation, elles affectent nos intérêts de sécurité et elles alimentent l'escalade régionale dans laquelle les Houthis portent une lourde responsabilité en dépit des résolutions adoptées par le Conseil de sécurité. Ce Conseil a pourtant clairement condamné ces attaques, notamment en adoptant les résolutions 2722 et 2739. Les États ont le droit de défendre leurs navires contre ces attaques en accord avec le droit international. Nous appelons donc les Houthis à mettre un terme à ces attaques et à libérer immédiatement le Galaxy leader et son équipage qui sont retenus depuis novembre 2023. La France condamne fermement l'attaque Houthi contre le navire pétrolier Sunyon et son équipage, une attaque qui risque de causer une catastrophe environnementale. Elle appelle également l'Iran à cesser son soutien aux actions déstabilisatrices dans la région. Monsieur le Président, la France réitère son attachement à la stabilité régionale et à la sécurité de ses partenaires dans la région. Elle poursuivra son engagement dans le cadre de l'opération de politique de sécurité et de défense de l'Union européenne Aspides pour protéger la sûreté maritime et la liberté de navigation conformément au droit international et en lien avec ses partenaires. Deuxième point, les Houthis doivent respecter le droit international humanitaire et garantir un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave. Les restrictions imposées par les Houthis aux opérations humanitaires les détentions
the
des
detentions
personnels
of
humanitaires
humanitarian personnel
et la
and the
désinformation ne
disinformation,
font qu'empirer la
which we have
situation.
seen have only
Alors que les populations
worsened the
civiles
situation
dépendent de
at a
l'aide
time
humanitaire
when
apportée par les
civilian
Nations Unies
populations
et leurs
depend
partenaires.
on humanitarian assistance delivered by the United
La France
Nations
condamne
and
les
UN
détentions
partners.
arbitraires des
France
personnels des
condemns
Nations
arbitrary
Unies
detentions of United
et
Nations
des ONG
personnel
locales et
and
internationales.
of local and international NGOs.
Elle exige leur
We
libération
demand
immédiate.
their immediate release.
Ces détentions, indignes et contraires au droit international humanitaire, entravent l'acheminement de l'aide et la réponse d'urgence, en particulier face à l'épidémie de choléra. Les Houthis doivent cesser de prendre en otage les populations civiles yéménites. Les Yéménites sont les premières victimes des restrictions que les Houthis imposent aux opérations humanitaires. Une réponse humanitaire d'urgence est nécessaire face à l'aggravation de la situation alimentaire et suite aux inondations qui ont touché le pays et ont conduit au déplacement de plus de 200 000 personnes. Monsieur le Président, au plan sécuritaire, il faut parvenir à une cessation complète et durable des hostilités pour éviter toute reprise du conflit sur le terrain. Les Houthis doivent revenir à la table des négociations conduites par l'envoyé spécial, dont l'action est essentielle. À cet égard, la France réitère à Hans Grünberg son plein soutien, notamment dans la mise en œuvre de sa feuille de route politique. Elle appuie le principe que la participation effective des femmes yéménites aux négociations doit être garantie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank the briefers for their briefings and welcome the participation of the representative of Yemen at today's meeting. China has always maintained that the Yemen issue should be resolved through diplomacy and political means. All relevant parties should stay committed to the overall direction of political solution, make efforts to meet each other halfway, and continue to accumulate consensus so as to jointly promote the Yemeni-led and Yemeni-owned comprehensive political process and resolve conflict and dispute through dialogue and negotiation. China supports the mediation efforts of Special Envoy Grunberg and expects all parties, in particular those countries with influence on Yemen, to play a constructive role in this regard. We call on the Yemeni government and the Houthis to jointly promote the implementation of their agreement on financial and aviation issues. We're concerned about the attacks on the oil tanker Sunyan in the Red Sea and a possible consequent oil spill and potential ecological and environmental impacts. We call on, once again, the Houthis to respect the rights of navigation of all merchant ships in the Red Sea in accordance with international law, stop causing disturbance, and maintain the safety of shipping lanes in the Red Sea. The relevant parties should exercise restraint, stop any action that exacerbates tension, and work to cool down the situation. At present, many governorates in Yemen were stricken by severe floods, making the already dire humanitarian situation even worse. The international community should increase its humanitarian assistance efforts for Yemen. China is seriously concerned over the detention of UN personnel in Yemen and calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all UN personnel. President, the tension in the Red Sea is a manifestation of the spillover of the Gaza conflict. It's been 11 months since the outbreak of the conflict in Gaza, and we have yet to see any hope for peace. The negative impacts of the conflict are fueling regional turmoil. China once again calls for the comprehensive implementation of all relevant Council resolutions and an immediate and durable ceasefire in Gaza. China supports the Council in taking further actions to put an end to the fighting and save lives.